I think the time has come for us to talk about the inferiority complex. What is an inferiority complex? Well, it is a very Freudian idea, and many people don't like the mentions of Freud because he made a lot of mistakes, and he has become somewhat of a joke to many because people are not necessarily exposed to his ideas. They're exposed to the way he was perceived during his lifetime. Again, Freud made a lot of mistakes, and many of his students addressed his mistakes, and many of his theories are continued to be studied nowadays, and we receive more information about some of the concepts that Freud had touched upon back in his day. But I do find much value in looking at some of the Freudian ideas, especially the ones that we have backed up somewhat by more modern research. And obviously I'm not an expert, I am just a person who is enthusiastic about learning about mental health, so take all my words with a grain of salt. So, what do I want to tell you about the inferiority complex? Well, the inferiority complex is that state of being when you consider yourself to be below everyone else in this imaginary hierarchy. And hierarchies are still disputed to be either a natural occurrence or a human-made social construct. So I'm not going to tell you much about hierarchies, but I would like to put an emphasis on the fact that most of us operate under the assumption that hierarchies exist and that they matter, at least in our minds. So if you have an inferiority complex, you feel like you are at the bottom of the hierarchy. You are the untouchable. You are the worst person due to certain factors. Now, the factors are going to vary from person to person, but there are some common trends about why people feel inferior to others. One of the more common trends is appearance. Unfortunately, people still use some kind of scale to compare themselves to others and rate themselves and others, and this is what gives many people much grief. The fact that they're not beautiful enough according to some kind of arbitrary standards they decided were the norm. So that's one area where the inferiority complex can play a major role or can be exhibited. The second area is the abilities area. And this is where people may feel incompetent in whatever it is they do. This is where the concept of the imposter syndrome comes in. Most of us feel like we're not good enough at what we do for various reasons. Either it's because we're new at what we're doing, or because we set unrealistic expectations for ourselves, or because we have this ideal that we imagine that we should strive for. So for one reason or another, the abilities is the second largest area where people may feel inferior and develop an inferiority complex. The third largest area, which according to me, the inferiority complex may affect, is achievements. So many people may feel like they haven't achieved enough. And again, the reasons may vary, just like in the second category. Perhaps they are comparing themselves to others, or they have unrealistic expectations of what life should be like. But I would argue that the third category is the one that is probably the most conductive to comparison, because it's pretty difficult to think you haven't achieved enough if you don't have anyone else to compare yourself to. So the inferiority complex can affect all areas of life. First of all, it definitely affects your mental health. So you feel much more anxious about everything you do. You have these unrealistic standards that you are trying to achieve. So you may become much more easily exhausted and you may experience burnout. That's one of the main concerns of most people who have issues connected to inferiority complex. Another huge area of discomfort is the relationships with other people. You may start viewing others through this very narrow lens of, black and white thinking. You either think of them as better than you or worse than you. And obviously there's usually a little bit of nuance thrown here and there, but the black and white thinking is very common for people who are prone to inferiority complex. So it definitely affects others negatively. If you feel inferior, this is going to rub off others, so to speak, and they may begin comparing themselves to you as well. You may have an unequal relationship dynamic because your expectations will be that they have a similar view of you as you have of yourself. So you may feel judged much more often. You may feel like people have the same kind of standards set up for you. So you may feel often like you're failing and everyone is watching you fail. And everyone is laughing at you, everyone thinks you're a sore loser, whatever. You just experience a range of negative emotions, which will affect all the areas of your life and all of your relationships sooner rather than later. The inferiority complex also will have a negative impact on your health, because many people will not care about their bodies for the sake of health. They will care for their bodies more for the sake of either appearances or anything that is somewhat connected to the way the world perceives you. So you may put a lot of energy, if you have an inferiority complex, into perfecting yourself, but you do not necessarily pay attention to what it is your body actually needs. And you may either go on a restrictive diet to be skinny or whatever, or you may over-exercise for the same reason, or you may have, other unhealthy relationships with food, which I'm not going to list them all, but you probably know what I'm talking about. So this can also occur due to this general feeling of inadequacy that one experiences when suffering from an inferiority complex. Well, now the question obviously is, if you feel like you suffer from any of these ailments, so to speak, what do you do? How do you get rid of this feeling of inferiority? And unfortunately, there is no quick solution to this, and you will have to work very carefully with yourself and ideally ask for help from somebody who cares about you. So this is one of the biggest pieces of advice. If you have access to trusted individuals, reach out to them. They can be family, friends, maybe a therapist or a social worker, somebody you think you can trust. So talk to them about your feelings. Do not ask them for reassurance. This is a big component that can actually make things worse. If you ask for their reassurance, you will continue to perpetuate that myth in your mind that something is wrong with you and you have to fix it. So if you just vent your frustrations about how inadequate and bad and whatever you are to people you trust, you may feel relief, at least for a time. Obviously, the ideal scenario would be therapy for most people who have inferiority complex issues. It's not always accessible to all of us. So I do encourage you to seek out help, not necessarily in the area of therapy, but it's very important not to stay in your head, because if you stay in your head and you have inferiority complex issues, you will unlikely make progress or improvements in this area of your life. So number one, talk to others, connect to others, preferably not strangers on the internet. That doesn't work so well, okay? Another thing you can do, and this is another very banal thing that you hear over and over and over again, but it actually works, is to observe yourself and listen to yourself and see what it is you may actually be lacking. If you feel your appearance is inadequate, why? What is it you're missing? Are you missing affection, intimacy, love? Because if you do, no amount of improvement in your appearance will ever help. And again, this is said over and over and over again, but unfortunately, this is the truth. You will have to start viewing yourself and your body as your friend, not as your enemy. And then you may be able to hear and actually realize what it is that is missing in your life. One more thing you can consider if you have an inferiority complex is try helping others. Again, that's kind of a counterintuitive thing that many people will feel a little icky about, but this is what can really make a huge difference. If you begin helping others without thinking of how you appear to them, without thinking of what they think of you, without yourself being in the equation as a separate ego, you may be able to overcome your feelings of inferiority, at least for some time. And then later on, you may become used to the cycle of you are not who you appear to be, you are what you do. Obviously, humans are very complex creatures, so none of these descriptions can really encompass the complexity of a human being. But obviously, if you stop viewing yourself as this bodily entity that is there to make impressions on others, most likely you will experience some relief. And also, you will help others, so it's a win-win in my book. And your help doesn't have to be grandiose, it doesn't have to be like life-changing, life-altering to others. It can be just something little. But if you begin connecting to others on the basis of what you do together and how you help each other, you will most likely develop a healthier outlook on yourself and the world. So these are just some of the tips and tricks that I've learned from my own feelings of inadequacy and inferiority, and we can definitely talk more about it in the future.